The judge who handed his wife over to 6 railroad magnates. The pact that destroyed a Boston legacy, 1889. In 1889, in the grand halls of Boston's elite society, Judge Theodore Ashford Hammond did the unthinkable. He created an arrangement that allowed 6 railroad magnates to share intimate relations with his own wife, Mrs. Eleanor Victoria Hammond. What began as a desperate scheme to secure his family's crumbling fortune ended by destroying one of Boston's most distinguished legacies. You're watching Uncle Tomas's Cabin, where we unearth the most disturbing and untold stories from America's Gilded Age. If this content shocks you, leave your like to support our work. We spend hours researching historical archives to bring you these narratives. Share this with anyone who needs to understand the dark underbelly of American history. You're watching Uncle Tomas's Cabin, the only place where America's real history is told without filters. Leave your comment telling us where you're watching from. We want to know if our audience is spread across America or around the world. And take a moment to comment on what you would do if you discovered a family secret as disturbing as this one. The year was 1889. America was experiencing the height of the Gilded Age, but beneath the glittering surface of wealth and progress, moral corruption festered in unexpected places. The Hammond Mansion, located on Beacon Hill's most prestigious street, was one of Boston's architectural jewels. Its Victorian Gothic spires rose 4 stories, commanding views of Boston Common and the Charles River. Inside, crystal chandeliers illuminated marble floors, and oil paintings of Hammond ancestors lined mahogany-paneled halls. Judge Theodore Ashford Hammond, at 54 years old, was respected throughout Massachusetts. Descendant of Mayflower passengers, his family had built their fortune through 3 generations of legal practice, shipping investments, and strategic marriages. His position on the Massachusetts Superior Court gave him influence that extended from Boston to Washington. Mrs. Eleanor Victoria Hammond, his wife of 17 years, was considered one of Boston's most refined ladies. At 38 years old, she maintained the elegance and poise expected of a woman in her social position. Educated at Miss Porter's School in Connecticut, she spoke French fluently, played Chopin on the grand piano, and hosted salons that attracted the city's intellectual elite. The marriage had been arranged in 1872, uniting 2 prominent Boston families. For 17 years, they had tried to have children. Eleanor conceived 5 times, but lost each baby within the first trimester. The physicians of the era couldn't explain the successive losses, attributing them to Eleanor's delicate constitution and nervous temperament. For Judge Hammond, the absence of heirs represented more than personal tragedy. It meant the extinction of a dynasty. Without children, his considerable fortune and the family name would disappear after his death. The social pressure was immense. In Gilded Age society, a man without descendants was considered incomplete, his life's work meaningless. Everything changed in November 1888. The judge received a confidential letter from a business associate in New York, describing unorthodox practices that had resulted in heirs for other prominent families facing similar difficulties. What was written in that letter would plant the seed for the most controversial decision of his life. The letter arrived on a cold November morning, delivered by private courier who had traveled by train from New York City. The sender was Jonathan Westbrook, a financier known for his creative solutions to delicate family matters among the Northeastern elite. The correspondence contained a detailed account of how certain families had resolved inheritance issues through unconventional means. "My dear Theodore," the letter began, "I am aware of your difficulties in producing an heir. Allow me to share knowledge that may seem controversial, but has proven effective among our circle." Mr. Cornelius Vanderbilt II faced a similar situation. His wife, after years of fruitless attempts, bore him 3 robust sons through an unorthodox method. The letter described how some families permitted specific business associates, men of means and proven genetic vigor, to maintain discreet relations with the wives, always under the husband's complete supervision and control. Children born from these arrangements were registered as legitimate, ensuring family continuity and preserving social standing. Judge Hammond read and reread the correspondence for weeks. The idea disturbed him profoundly, yet awakened desperate hope. His Puritan upbringing and Victorian values made the proposal almost unthinkable. However, the prospect of dying without heirs tormented him more than any moral consideration. During December 1888, the judge discreetly observed the railroad magnates who frequented his social circles. He began noticing details previously overlooked. Which men were healthiest? Which demonstrated superior intelligence? Which possessed physical characteristics that might improve his lineage? The Gilded Age had created a mentality where business relationships could be leveraged for personal gain, where anything could be negotiated if the price was right. For Judge Hammond, these wealthy railroad men represented instruments that could solve his succession problem. Mrs. Eleanor noticed changes in her husband's behavior. He observed her with new intensity, asked strange questions about her monthly cycles, and demonstrated renewed interest in matters of procreation. When he finally decided to reveal the letter's contents, he chose a December evening after dinner. "Eleanor," he said, "we must discuss our situation. I have a proposal that could give us the children we desperately want, but it requires your complete cooperation and discretion." Eleanor's initial reaction was shock and revulsion. The idea of maintaining intimate relations with other men contradicted everything she had learned about morality and social position. She argued, wept, and begged her husband to reconsider. But the judge had made his decision. He presented the proposal not as a request but as a determination. In Victorian society, women had little power over their own lives. A husband's authority was absolute, especially in matters considered family business. January 1889 marked the beginning of the most bizarre arrangement in the history of the Hammond family. Judge Theodore established rigorous criteria for selecting the railroad magnates who would participate in his plan. This would not be random. Every detail was calculated to maximize chances of success. The first criterion was physical health. The judge consulted discreetly with Dr. William Morrison, the family physician, under the pretense of discussing general health matters. The doctor, unknowing of the true intentions, provided opinions on the robust constitution of various men in their social circle. The second criterion was intelligence and business acumen. The judge wanted men who had proven their capability through railroad empire building, men whose mental faculties might be passed to future heirs. The third criterion, though never admitted openly, was social standing. The judge wanted the arrangement to involve only men of equal or superior status. Any children born from the agreement needed to appear natural products of elite society. After 3 weeks of careful consideration, 6 railroad magnates were selected. Charles Pemberton Bradford, 45, president of the Boston and Maine Railroad, married with 4 children, known for his shrewd business mind and robust health. Edward Wellington Cabot, 38, vice president of the New York, New Haven and Hartford Railroad, a widower whose first wife had died in childbirth, renowned for his physical vigor. James Rutherford Lowell, 42, director of the Pennsylvania Railroad's northeastern operations, Harvard-educated, fluent in 4 languages, considered one of Boston's most cultured gentlemen. Henry Wadsworth Elliott, 40, controlling shareholder in the Boston and Albany Railroad, from one of Boston's oldest families, known for his exceptional mathematical mind. Samuel Adams Winthrop, 43, chief engineer of the Union Pacific's Eastern Connections, inventor of several railway innovations, respected for his technical genius. Robert Gould Shaw, 39, financier who controlled significant shares in multiple railroad companies, athletic and vigorous, known for his commanding presence. The selection was not immediately communicated to the chosen men. The judge first needed to establish the agreement's rules and prepare Eleanor for what was coming. During February, he arranged for a private suite at the Parker House Hotel, away from curious eyes. The location would be used for the encounters, ensuring privacy and complete control over the situation. Pause for a moment and reflect. We're discussing a woman being treated as a reproductive instrument, her body negotiated among men of power. Victorian morality, despite its outward propriety, enabled profound exploitation behind closed doors. If you're feeling disturbed by this story, leave your like. This is exactly the reflection we need to have about our past. On March 1, 1889, Judge Hammond convened the 6 selected railroad magnates for a private meeting in his study. It was a cold Boston evening, snow falling softly outside the mansion's windows. The men gathered, curious about the urgent confidential matter their colleague had mentioned. "Gentlemen," the judge began, standing before the fireplace, "I have invited you here to propose a business arrangement of the most delicate nature. What I am about to suggest requires absolute discretion and the honor of every man present." The 6 magnates exchanged glances, intrigued. These were men accustomed to bold business deals, to negotiations involving millions of dollars and thousands of workers. But nothing prepared them for what came next. "My wife and I have been unable to produce an heir," Judge Hammond continued. "This threatens not only my family's legacy but also the various business interests and charitable foundations that require continuation. I am proposing an arrangement whereby each of you would have the opportunity to contribute to solving this problem." The revelation caused visible shock. Charles Bradford's cigar nearly fell from his hand. Edward Cabot shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The others remained motionless, processing the impossible proposition. The judge explained the arrangement's terms. Each magnate would have a designated day of the week for private encounters with Mrs. Eleanor at the Parker House suite. The encounters would occur during her fertile periods, under the judge's indirect supervision. Any attempt at contact outside the established schedule would result in immediate exposure and social ruin. The magnates who participated would receive certain benefits: exclusive business information, favorable legal judgments in railroad disputes, and social connections that could prove valuable. But it was also clear that refusal might result in mysterious business difficulties. "If one of you succeeds in fathering a child with my wife," the judge declared, "that man will receive permanent favor in all my legal and business dealings. The others will continue receiving the promised benefits for their discretion." The promise of advantage was both motivation and control. The judge knew this would create competition among the magnates, decreasing chances of conspiracy or exposure. Charles Bradford was designated for Mondays, Edward Cabot for Tuesdays, James Lowell for Wednesdays, Henry Elliott for Thursdays, Samuel Winthrop for Fridays, and Robert Shaw for Saturdays. Sundays were reserved as days of rest, a bitter irony given the religious nature of Boston society. Mrs. Eleanor, who had been informed of the meeting's purpose, remained in her chambers, feeling profound humiliation and dread. She had spent weeks trying to convince her husband to abandon the idea, but her pleas were ignored. In Victorian society, she had no choice but to submit to her husband's will. The family physician was informed about special treatments Mrs. Eleanor would receive to increase her chances of conception. Dr. Morrison, though surprised, did not question the judge's decisions. Medicine of the era frequently recommended unorthodox methods for fertility problems. The first week of the arrangement was scheduled to begin in mid-March, coinciding with Eleanor's fertile period. The magnates received instructions about how to proceed, what to wear, and how to behave during the encounters. Everything was planned to maintain the appearance of dignity, even in such a degrading situation. Monday, March 18, 1889, dawned cold and gray. The typical Boston spring weather cast a melancholy atmosphere that seemed to reflect the tense environment dominating the Hammond household. Mrs. Eleanor awoke knowing this would be the most difficult day of her life. Charles Bradford had received detailed instructions the previous evening. He was to arrive at the Parker House suite at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Judge Hammond would remain in an adjacent room, ensuring no interruptions and that the encounter proceeded as planned. The suite had been furnished simply but appropriately. A bed with clean linens, a washbasin with perfumed water, and a single window offering a view of Boston Common. The environment was prepared to maintain some appearance of civility in a completely dehumanizing situation. Mrs. Eleanor arrived punctually, wearing a simple cotton dress. Her eyes were red from crying and her hands trembled visibly. Charles Bradford awaited her, standing, equally nervous and uncomfortable. Both knew they had no choice in the situation. The encounter lasted less than 30 minutes. There was no conversation or attempt to create intimacy. Both wanted it finished as quickly as possible. Bradford, despite his position as railroad president and his business acumen, understood perfectly that he was being used as a reproductive instrument in an elite bargain. Mrs. Eleanor endured the situation with the resignation of someone who had lost all control over her own life. Judge Hammond waited in the adjacent room, smoking cigars nervously and checking his pocket watch repeatedly. When Eleanor emerged from the suite, he escorted her back to the mansion without speaking a word. Bradford waited several minutes before leaving, using the rear entrance to avoid being seen. The routine repeated in the following days. Edward Cabot on Tuesday demonstrated even more nervousness than Bradford. His recent widowhood made the situation particularly uncomfortable. James Lowell on Wednesday was the most efficient of the first three, treating the encounter as another task to be completed. Mrs. Eleanor developed mental strategies to endure the encounters. She closed her eyes and transported herself to memories of her childhood at Miss Porter's school. She mentally recited poetry in French or planned the flower arrangements for the coming week. Anything that helped her disconnect from reality. Other members of Boston society began noticing unusual patterns. The 6 magnates were seen entering the Parker House Hotel at specific times, and Mrs. Eleanor made regular afternoon visits to the same location. But the rigid social protocols of the era prevented direct questioning. Henry Elliot on Thursday was the first to attempt some communication with Eleanor. He asked respectfully if she was well and if she needed anything. The unexpected gentleness made her weep during the entire encounter, which left Elliot deeply disturbed. Samuel Winthrop on Friday brought a small bouquet of hothouse flowers. The gesture, though simple, represented an attempt to humanize a completely dehumanized situation. Eleanor kept the flowers. They were the only ones she received during that dark period. It's important to remember we're dealing with a historical period where social pressure and patriarchal control completely subjugated women, even those from the elite. At the same time, these powerful men were complicit in an arrangement that reduced all involved to mere instruments of dynasty building. May 1889 brought the first complications to Judge Hammond's arrangement. Robert Shaw, designated for Saturdays, began demonstrating signs of profound psychological suffering. As a man with strong moral convictions despite his business ruthlessness, he understood the ethical dimension of what he was being compelled to do. During the third Saturday encounter, Shaw refused to proceed. He remained outside the suite, standing at the window, looking out at the city. Judge Hammond, furious at the defiance, threatened exposure of Shaw's involvement. But Shaw maintained his position, explaining he preferred social ruin to continuing this sin. The situation created the arrangement's first major conflict. The judge couldn't simply expose Shaw without risking revelation of the entire scheme. Discovery would destroy not just Shaw but all participants, including the judge himself. Mrs. Eleanor, who had developed respect for Shaw due to his business integrity and charitable works, interceded on his behalf. She suggested to her husband they find a way to release him without creating alarm. It was the first time since the arrangement began that she took any initiative. The solution was to allow Shaw to withdraw with a plausible excuse. Sudden business interests in California required his extended absence from Boston. Officially, he was expanding railroad investments westward. In reality, he was being released to avoid problems. Henry Elliot, who had shown compassion during his encounters, assumed Saturdays as well as his regular Thursdays. The change created a different dynamic. 2 encounters weekly with the same person generated unprecedented familiarity between him and Eleanor. Elliot was the most intellectually refined of the group, a man whose Harvard education and mathematical genius revealed a sophisticated mind. During their encounters, he began to notice and address small discomforts, adjusting the room temperature, providing books she might enjoy, ensuring fresh flowers were always present. This attention to detail and care for the environment began creating a less hostile atmosphere. Mrs. Eleanor started to anticipate Thursdays and Saturdays with less dread, knowing that Elliot would make the environment more comfortable and less oppressive. During June, another problem emerged. Edward Cabot began demonstrating possessiveness toward Eleanor. On 2 occasions, he was seen observing her discreetly when she attended social functions. The behavior was extremely dangerous. Any suspicion of personal interest could result in scandal and exposure. Charles Bradford, as the senior member of the group, was tasked with speaking to Cabot. The conversation was direct. Any deviation from established rules would endanger all participants. Cabot understood and moderated his behavior, but the incident revealed how the situation was psychologically affecting everyone involved. James Lowell developed a completely different strategy. He decided to treat the encounters as business transactions, focusing exclusively on the reproductive objective. His mechanical and distant approach was less emotionally disturbing but also more cold and dehumanizing. Samuel Winthrop maintained his habit of bringing small gifts, books of poetry, fine chocolates, or flowers from his greenhouse. His natural gentleness created moments of humanity amid the degrading situation. In July, Mrs. Eleanor began presenting the first symptoms of pregnancy. July 1889 brought the news Judge Hammond had desperately awaited. Mrs. Eleanor began experiencing morning nausea, breast tenderness, and a missed menstrual period, symptoms she knew well from previous pregnancies. But this time there was a crucial difference. She didn't know which man had fathered the child she carried.